Red River Valley, Minnesota, October, 1888. The wind had no respect for the landscape. It scoured the flat, black earth, a relentless harbinger of the cold that was already threading its way into the bones of the land. On a quarter section of freshly broken sod, a man named Pieter Verhoeven was building a house, and his neighbors thought he was a fool. It wasn't the location they questioned, nor the man's work ethic. Pieter worked from before sunrise until the last vestiges of light failed him. It was the method. He was erecting two complete sets of plank walls, one inside the other, with a 4-inch gap of open air between them. Rusk Hamblin, the township carpenter, and a man whose opinion on lumber carried the weight of law, stopped his wagon on the rutted track to watch. He was a broad, confident man, whose hands knew the language of wood better than most men knew their own Bibles. He squinted, his skepticism a physical force. "What in God's name is that, Verhoeven?" he called out, his voice carrying easily on the unimpeded wind. "Building a house for your house?" A few other settlers, Silas Croft and Jedediah Stone among them, had gathered. They leaned on their wagon beds, arms crossed, sharing smirks. Pieter, a man of spare build and even sparer words, straightened up from setting a stud. He wiped a hand on his canvas trousers. "It is a wall?" he said, his Flemish accent thickening the simple words. "It's 2 walls with a waste of good air in the middle," Hamblin countered, stepping down from his wagon. He walked over, running a critical hand over the outer frame. "This thing will rack in the first prairie gale. It has no sheer strength. You've built a kite, man, not a cabin. It's the damnedest, most foolish thing I've seen in 20 years of building." Pieter merely nodded, a slight, almost imperceptible motion. "The air is the point," he said softly, and turned back to his work, leaving the carpenter and the other men to shake their heads. The word spread through the valley before the first snows fell. The quiet Fleming, the one who kept to himself, was building a crazy, hollow house, a house with nothing in the middle. What did this Flemish furnace builder, a man who had spent his life not with timber, but with fire brick and iron grates, understand about the physics of conduction that a master carpenter and a community of seasoned frontiersmen had tragically missed? The answer was coming, carried on the back of a winter that would be spoken of for generations, a winter that would not reward tradition, but only what worked. I promise you, by the end of this story, you will understand the profound power of that empty space. You will learn the fundamental principle that governs nearly every modern insulated structure on the planet. Stick with us. If you appreciate learning the hidden histories of practical genius, consider subscribing to our channel and hitting the like button. And tell us in the comments, what's the most clever, low-tech solution to a big problem you've ever seen? Pieter Verhoeven was not a frontiersman. He was not a farmer, not a logger, and certainly not a carpenter in the way Rusk Hamblin was. His hands, though calloused, were shaped by a different kind of work. In his former life in Flanders, he had been a master kilnwright, a builder of industrial furnaces for firing bricks and ceramics. His world had been one of contained, hellish temperatures. He worked with refractory clay, with iron strapping that glowed cherry red, with the precise science of channeling heat and holding it captive. He understood that the greatest enemy of a sustained, even temperature wasn't the fuel source, but the vessel that held it. His expertise was not in keeping the cold out, but in keeping the heat in. He and his wife Anneliese had come to America with their 2 children, Jan and Lena, seeking land and a life less constrained by the old world's rigid hierarchies. They had arrived in Minnesota the previous autumn, full of hope that curdled into a grim struggle for survival. Their first winter was a litany of miseries, a brutal education in the physics of cold. They had built a standard single-wall cabin, just as their neighbors advised, chinking the gaps between the rough sawn planks with mud and moss. It was a solid, respectable structure by local standards. And it was a sieve. The cold didn't just seep in, it poured. The moment the sun dipped below the horizon, any warmth bled out of the walls, as if drawn by a vacuum. Annalise would cook their meager supper, and by the time they finished eating, a chill was already creeping back into the single room. The iron stove, though fed a steady diet of precious cordwood, fought a losing battle. Its heat radiated outwards a few feet, creating a small bubble of comfort in a sea of biting cold. To move away from it was to enter a different climate zone. The nights were the worst. The family slept in their coats, huddled together under a mountain of wool blankets and buffalo hides. In the morning, the water in the bucket would be a solid block of ice. Frost would coat the inside of the walls, a delicate crystalline lacework of pure misery. Sometimes, in the deepest cold of January, the frost would creep up the nails, driven through the planks, and the intense temperature differential would cause the wood to contract so violently that the nails would groan and pull free overnight, leaving tiny dark holes in the frosted walls. The children were always coughing. Little Lena's cheeks were perpetually chapped and raw. Each morning was a ritual of shivering desperation. Peter would rise in the near dark, his breath pluming in his own home, and work to coax the fire back to life from a bed of stubborn coals. It often took the better part of an hour before the stove threw off enough heat to make the room barely tolerable, an hour of burning fuel just to undo the damage of the night. He watched his woodpile, a monument to his summer's labor, shrink at an alarming rate. He saw the same worry in the eyes of his neighbors. They were all fighting the same war, and they were all losing, slowly. It was during one of those frozen, pre-dawn hours, staring at the frost on the nailheads, that the memory of his old trade surfaced, not as nostalgia, but as a solution. He remembered the great annealing kilns, designed to cool glass over days, not hours. They weren't built with thicker walls, but with smarter walls. They had an inner chamber of fire brick, a sealed gap of air, and then an outer shell. The air, he knew, was the true insulator. The air held the heat. The problem wasn't the Minnesota winter. The problem was the wall. The conventional failure of the frontier cabin was a simple, brutal matter of physics. The settlers of the Red River Valley were masters of expedient construction. They could raise a cabin in a week, felling timber, hewing logs, or sawing planks with practiced efficiency. Rusk Hamblin was the apex of this tradition. His joinery was tight, his roofs were sound, and his cabins were considered the best in the county. But even his own home, a model of the craft, was a thermal disaster. The primary culprit was conduction. Heat is simply the vibration of molecules. In a solid material like a wooden plank, those molecules are packed tightly together. When one side of the wall is heated by a stove, its molecules begin to vibrate faster. They bump into their neighbors, which in turn start vibrating and bump into their neighbors. This chain reaction carries the thermal energy directly through the solid wood to the cold exterior, where it is lost to the outside air. A 6-inch thick pine wall felt substantial, but to the laws of thermodynamics it was a bridge, a thermal highway for heat to escape. The settlers understood this intuitively, if not scientifically. Their solution was always more wood on the fire, more chinking in the gaps, thicker logs. But it was a brute force approach, like trying to fill a bucket with a hole in the bottom by pouring water in faster. They were treating the symptom, the cold, inside, instead of the disease, the heat loss through the walls. That first winter, Peter saw the evidence everywhere. He saw his neighbors banking their cabins with earth and snow, a desperate attempt to add mass and block the wind. It helped, but only marginally. The conduction through the walls themselves remained the primary leak. He saw the constant, thin streams of smoke rising from every chimney, day and night, a visual representation of the valley's dwindling fuel supply being offered up to the sky. Silas Croft, a man with 4 young children, confessed to Peter that he was already halfway through his winter woodpile by New Year's Day. Jedediah Stone's wife was sick with a lung fever that wouldn't quit, her recovery hampered by the inescapable chill in their home. The cold was more than an inconvenience. It was a predator, stalking the vulnerable and taxing the strong. It was a silent thief of resources, health, and hope. Peter understood what the others did not. The problem wasn't that the cold was getting in. The problem was that the heat was getting out. And it was getting out through the very walls they had built for protection. By late summer of 1888, Peter began his grand experiment. He chose plank construction over logs for precision. He started not with one foundation, but with 2 parallel stone footings, separated by a 4-inch channel. This alone was enough to draw Rusk Hamblin's attention. Upon this double foundation, he began to build. First, he erected the frame for the outer wall. He used standard pine planks, but he took extraordinary care, milling the edges for a tight fit and using tarred canvas to seal the joints at the foundation and the corners. This was his outer shell, his weather barrier. Then, he began framing the inner wall, a completely separate structure, resting on the inner stone footing. It was a mirror of the outer wall, plank for plank. Between the two, the 4-inch gap remained. This was the feature that baffled everyone. It looked like a colossal waste of lumber and effort. Hamblin made several visits, his professional curiosity warring with his deep-seated skepticism. "I've thought on it, Verhoeven," he said one afternoon, gesturing at the strange construction. "You're doubling your lumber cost and getting no more usable space. And I'm telling you, without cross-bracing between those walls, the wind will get to work on them. They'll move independent of each other. They'll shear the roof right off your foundation. You'll have no recourse with the township insurance assessor. They'll call it faulty design." It was a valid, expert criticism based on decades of experience with single-frame structures. A wall derived its strength from being a single, integrated unit. Peter had deliberately forsaken that. He paused, holding a hammer. "It will not move," he replied calmly. "The roof will lock them together at the top. The foundation holds them at the bottom. It is a box inside a box." "It's a coffin inside a coffin," muttered Silas Croft, who was helping Hamblin with the delivery. Peter ignored them. His focus was on the integrity of the seal. The principle of the air gap was useless if the air could move. Every seam, every joint, every place where wood met wood was meticulously sealed. He caulked the window frames not once, but twice, on the outer wall and the inner wall. He built the door into a complex double jam system. Annalise watched him, a quiet worry in her eyes. "It looks so empty, Peter," she said one evening, looking at the hollow channel running the length of the house, "like a secret passageway to nowhere." "It is a passageway for nothing, Annalise," he told her, "and that is what will keep us warm." He was building a ship in a bottle, where the bottle itself was the house, and the precious, delicate thing he was preserving inside was not a model ship, but a pocket of still, non-moving air. The mockery from his neighbors lasted for the 2 months of construction. The validation, he wagered, would last a lifetime. To understand the genius of Pieter Verhoeven's wall, you must first understand the simple physics of heat transfer. Heat moves in 3 ways: convection, radiation, and conduction. For a frontier cabin, the most significant villain was conduction. Conduction is heat transfer through direct contact. Imagine holding one end of a metal poker and putting the other end in a fire. Soon, your hand will be burned. Not because the flame touched you, but because the heat energy traveled molecule by molecule up the solid poker. Wood is a much poorer conductor than metal, which is why it's a good building material. But it is still a solid. A typical pine plank wall in 1888 might have an R value, a measure of thermal resistance of about 6. That meant it was 6 times better than nothing, but still a significant avenue for heat loss. When the temperature outside was minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit and the inside was 60 degrees Fahrenheit, there was a 90-degree differential. That difference created immense thermal pressure, pushing the heat energy from the stove directly through the solid planks to the outside world. The settlers were essentially trying to heat the entire Red River Valley. Now consider the air. Air is a gas. Its molecules are spread far apart. For heat to conduct through air, one vibrating molecule has to travel a relatively long way to bump into another one and transfer its energy. This makes it an exceptionally poor conductor of heat. In fact, a pocket of still, unmoving air is about 40 times less conductive than solid pine wood. It is one of the most effective insulators on the planet. The key word is still. If the air is allowed to move, it creates a convection current. Warm air rises, hits the cold outer wall, cools, sinks, moves to the warm inner wall, heats up, and rises again, creating a loop that actively transports heat from the inside to the outside. This is why a drafty house is a cold house. Pieter, the furnace builder, understood this intimately. His kilns were designed to stop both conduction and convection. By building 2 walls and meticulously sealing the 4-inch gap between them, he wasn't just building a hollow wall. He was creating a permanent, 4-inch thick blanket of still air that wrapped his entire house. He had effectively stopped the primary highway of heat loss. The heat from his stove would warm the inner wall, but it could barely cross the air gap. The conduction was arrested. The R value of his wall assembly wasn't 6. It was likely closer to 20 or 25, a number unheard of at the time and respectable even by modern standards. He had built a thermal fortress, and the moat wasn't filled with water, but with the one thing his neighbors had in abundance: empty air. That winter arrived not with a gentle dusting of snow, but like an invading army. In early January, a high-pressure system from the Arctic settled over the northern plains and did not move. It became known as the Prairie cold lock. For 22 consecutive days, the temperature in the Red River Valley never rose above minus 25 degrees Fahrenheit. At night, it plummeted to minus 35 degrees Fahrenheit, sometimes minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit, with a wind that honed the cold to a razor's edge. The valley hunkered down in a state of siege. The world became brittle. Trees cracked with reports like rifle shots in the night. Metal became fragile. The very air seemed to crystallize. For the settlers in their conventional cabins, it was a nightmare. They became slaves to their stoves, feeding them constantly. The interiors of their homes were a geography of extreme temperatures. To be near the stove was to risk scorching your clothes. To be 10 feet away was to feel the cold creeping into your marrow. The walls were canvases of thick, white frost. Every nailhead was a star of ice. Silas Croft's family abandoned their main room and lived entirely in their small kitchen, huddled around the cook stove. Jedediah Stone's wife took a turn for the worse, her breathing a shallow, rattling thing in the frigid air of their cabin. Rusk Hamblin, the master carpenter, found his own expertly built house wanting. He was burning through his seasoned oak at a terrifying pace, and still his wife and children wore their coats to the supper table. Then there was the Verhoeven house. From the outside, it looked like any other, save for one bizarre phenomenon. On the coldest days, a faint mist of condensation would form and freeze on the outside of the outer walls. The moisture from the family's breathing and cooking, which in every other cabin was freezing on the inside walls, was passing through the inner wall, crossing the air gap, and only then finding a surface cold enough to condense upon. It was the first sign that something extraordinary was happening within. Inside, life was shockingly, utterly normal. The temperature was a steady 65 degrees. The stove was not roaring. It was fed with a few logs at a time. Its damper turned low, maintaining a small, efficient fire. The contrast was stark and absolute. Outside, the world was locked at 31 degrees below zero. Inside, Jan and Lena were playing on the floorboards in their shirt sleeves. Annalise had a small pot of parsley on the windowsill, a splash of impossible green against a world of white. The air didn't have the dry, scorched quality of an overfired room, nor the damp chill of a cold one. It was just comfortable. This was the proof of normalcy, the domestic warmth that cold had made impossible. The inner walls were not only free of frost, they were warm and dry to the touch. Peter would run his hand over the smooth planks and feel only a gentle, pleasant warmth. He had built more than a house. He had built a pocket of a different season. Rusk Hamblin held out for 2 weeks, his pride as stubborn as the frozen earth. But the cold was relentless, and his woodpile was shrinking to a pathetic mound. His children were sick, his wife was exhausted, and his own house felt like a personal failure. One afternoon, with the wind howling and the temperature at a soul-crushing -33 degrees Fahrenheit, he surrendered. He bundled himself in his heaviest coat and walked the half-mile to the Verhoeven place. He didn't plan to knock. He just wanted to see. He circled the house, his boots squeaking on the packed snow. He saw the strange frost on the outer walls, a detail that made no sense to his carpenter's mind. He pulled off a mitten and placed his bare palm against the outer planks. The cold was shocking, a pain that shot up his arm. It was as cold as any tree, as cold as the very air itself. This was what he expected. He steeled himself and walked to the door. He knocked, the sound deadened by the dense air. Peter opened it. Hamblin braced for the familiar scene. A blast of frigid air from the door opening, and the sight of a family huddled around a furiously burning stove. He got neither. What hit him was not a wave of heat, but a gentle, pervasive warmth. It was as if he had stepped out of the wind and into a calm, sunny autumn afternoon. His eyes, accustomed to the dim, fire-lit interiors of his neighbors, took a moment to adjust. The room was evenly lit. The fire in the stove was a low, peaceful flicker. And the Verhoeven family? They were simply living. Annalise was sewing at a small table. The children were reading a book on the floor. No one was wearing a coat. Peter said nothing, simply holding the door for him. Hamblin stepped inside, his mind struggling to reconcile the sensory data. His gaze went to the walls. They were bare wood, just like his own. No frost, no dampness. He walked over to the one nearest him, the one facing the brutal north wind. He expected to feel a radiating cold, the way you feel it from a block of ice. He raised his hand, the memory of the searing cold from the outside plank still fresh. He pressed his palm flat against the inner wall. It was warm, not hot, not even particularly heated. It felt like a piece of wood that had been lying in the sun. It was bone dry. The bitter, life-sapping cold of the prairie winter stopped somewhere in the 4 inches of empty space he had mocked. It simply wasn't here. The gap between what he knew and what he felt was the entire world. All his experience, all his rules, all his certainty shattered in the silent touch of a warm plank. He turned to look at the quiet Fleming, his face a mask of awe and disbelief. The words came out in a hoarse whisper. "You didn't build a wall, Peter," Hamblin said, his voice full of a new, profound respect. "You built a calm." When the great thaw finally came in March, the valley emerged, blinking, to count the cost. The winter had taken a toll on livestock, on health, on the very spirit of the settlers. But it had also revealed a truth. As the ground softened, Rusk Hamblin began construction on a new workshop for himself. Neighbors watched with interest. He laid a double foundation. He framed 2 separate walls. He was meticulous about sealing the joints. When Silas Croft asked him what he was doing, Hamblin didn't mention Pieter Verhoeven. He wiped his brow and spoke with the casual authority of an expert revealing a new discovery. "It's a structural innovation I've been developing," he explained. "A cavity wall. The internal bracing provides superior resistance to prairie winds." He never mentioned heat. He framed it in the language he understood: structure. It was his way of adopting the idea without admitting his own dogma had been wrong. The appropriation was a form of flattery, the highest compliment one practical man could pay another. That summer, he built 3 more structures in the township using the same method, including an addition to the schoolhouse. And in the fall, he did something that would change the face of building on the northern plains. He wrote a short, technical notice, complete with a simple diagram, and paid to have it published in both the Red River Gazette and the widely read St. Paul Pioneer Press. He called it the Hamblin Insulated Wall, a carpenter's solution for prairie climates. He described the construction method, touted its structural soundness, and added, almost as an afterthought, that it seemed to hold the heat of a stove better than a standard wall. The idea, now laundered through a trusted local authority, spread like wildfire. Carpenters and settlers who would have dismissed the ramblings of a strange Flemish furnace builder paid attention to Rusk Hamblin. By the winter of 1890, dozens of Hamblin walls had been built across Minnesota and the Dakotas. The letters that came back were not about structural integrity. They were universally ecstatic about the warmth, the comfort, and the staggering savings in firewood. The name stuck, but the genius belonged to Pieter Verhoeven. What Pieter Verhoeven had done, with no formal training in thermodynamics, was anticipate the core principle of modern building science by nearly a century. The empty space he so carefully created and sealed is the direct ancestor of the insulated wall cavities in every modern home. Today, we fill that space with fiberglass bats, blown-in cellulose, or spray foam, but these materials are mostly just fluff. Their primary function is simply to trap air and stop it from moving, creating millions of tiny air pockets that do the real work of insulation. The R value we see printed on insulation is, in essence, a measure of how well it creates the calm that Rusk Hamblin discovered on that frozen afternoon. Pieter had achieved with a 4-inch gap of nothing what we now achieve with complex manufactured products. He had grasped the fundamental truth. The most powerful insulator wasn't a material you could add, but a void you could create. The frontier was a place of profound pragmatism. It cared little for theories, credentials, or the way things had always been done. It rewarded what worked. In the end, the story of Pieter Verhoeven's wall is a story about the nature of solutions. We are often conditioned to believe that solving a problem requires adding something: more material, more effort, more complexity. Pieter's genius was subtractive. He saw that the path to warmth lay not in a thicker wall, but in a hollow one. He understood a paradox that remains deeply resonant: the gap that holds nothing, the carefully engineered void, the pocket of stillness. That is what holds everything. It holds the warmth, the comfort, the safety, the health of the family. It holds the very possibility of a civilized life in an uncivilized climate. The empty space was the most valuable thing he ever built. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the past. If you found this story of ingenuity and practical wisdom valuable, please hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next exploration. And let us know in the comments, do you think Rusk Hamblin was wrong to take credit for the design? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Disclaimer: This video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictionalized for narrative purposes. However, the techniques and scientific principles are based on real historical practices and an understanding of thermal dynamics. The application of any building technique today should be done in accordance with modern building codes, safety guidelines, and regulations. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.